Hey guys, welcome back to Critical Flick. Today I'll be reviewing The Greatest Beer Run Ever, now streaming on Apple TV+. The Greatest Beer Run tells the story of Chicky Donahue, who's played by Zac Efron, and it takes place during the Vietnam War. You have Chicky Donahue, he's living in New York City. A lot of his friends have already gone off to the war. He's lost a lot of friends to the war. He's kind of this guy who's down on his luck. He's a little bit of a screw-up, and he's trying to find a little bit of purpose in life, and he decides that during a drunken night at the bar that he will go to Vietnam on a merchant vessel because that's kind of the industry he works in, and he's going to deliver beers to his friends to kind of raise the morale, to show his support for the troops, because he's seeing a lot of things back home where people are divided about the war. And this is actually based on a true story. I have to say, when I first went into it and I read the synopsis, I assumed it was some kind of crazy Hollywood concoction, but the fact that it's true makes it that much more interesting to me. Now, one of the biggest things I'll have to say about this movie is on its face and in its marketing, it feels like it's going to be very comedy heavy and kind of like a laugh out loud, ridiculous comedy, but it's really not. This movie is really serious for the most part. There are some comedic elements. Zac Efron brings some of that charismatic likability and that comedy that he always seems to bring to his characters. But the thing is, it really is a story about someone who doesn't really fully understand the horrors of war being thrown into them. It's kind of an outside observer, and I think that's where the movie really excels. I think it'll disappoint people because I think the marketing is very confusing, as well as like what people expect from a movie like this. But I think if you go into it not knowing what to expect, you might be pleasantly surprised by some of the really intense themes and really strong messages that this movie tries to get across. So one of the main themes about this movie in particular is that war is messy. War is something that people don't fully understand unless you've experienced it. And kind of seeing it on the screen and what your idea of war is might be completely different than what's on the ground. It really takes place in that period of time after World War II and during Vietnam, where public sentiment has changed. The understanding of what war is, what war fundamentally is, has changed. So you have generations that fought in World War II, people that lived through World War II, that understood the very almost black and white nuances of that war. And then you have Vietnam being a far more complex political engagement. So seeing that lens is really interesting. Like I said, I thought this movie was going to be a comedy, but it really tackles some of those like political, social things happening during that time. For a bulk of the movie, it really dives into how the media is portrayed and the media's role when it comes to war. Because obviously, pre-Vietnam, there was some media coverage, but we didn't see it on the ground and as in your face and as dark and gritty as you saw during Vietnam and moving forward. And the movie tackles that. It shows that really the purpose of having the truth, whether you want to believe it or not. And it really struggles that line between what do we want to know, what do we need to know, and what's the reality of the situation. The movie does have some of those tropes that you've seen in a lot of Vietnam movies that we've had in the past, where it talks about kind of the evils of both sides, kind of the political muddiness of it, and kind of the events and the atrocities that happened right on the battlefield and we kind of didn't know, and just really just the messiness of that war. So it dives into that. I don't know if it does it any better than movies we've seen in the past. I think some hit a little bit harder than this movie. One of the things that the movie does struggle a little bit, in my opinion, is with tone shifts, because I think sometimes it does want to be a little bit more of like a comedy and more lighthearted, accessible film, but other times it hits really hard. And I do think the moments where it takes off the gloves and shows the horrors of the situation and this character experiencing it is when the movie's at its best, because you have this person who is fully naive to the situation. They don't understand really what's happening. They don't understand war, and they're being thrown into it as just a civilian. And you don't really get to see a glimpse of that very often in society, especially back then. So I think that was where the movie is more interesting, when someone's trying to struggle with their idea of what's happening, what is actually happening. And I think Zac Efron does a good job of showing someone who is kind of a likable, go-lucky guy in the beginning, and then by the end, he's like almost like a grizzled individual that's been through this experience of being in war. The production design is actually pretty good. I think that they have some good use of costuming. It looks the way that it should look, in my opinion. I think obviously the sets, having the military equipment, the explosion, the visual effects, all that you expect from a war film is there. It's not amazing top tier like we've seen in other movies in the past, but it's not horrible, especially for a movie that I didn't know was going to go to this degree into what actually the war was. It's interesting that there are a few actors that are in this movie that are very big actors that don't necessarily have the largest roles. Russell Crowe is there as a reporter who's there on the ground in Vietnam. I think he does a solid job as someone who's kind of that person that's been through it, the person that's very jaded to the world, juxtaposed to Zac Efron's character, who doesn't really know what's happening. By the end, how do they come together and learn from each other? But then you have Bill Murray's character, who plays the colonel. He's someone back in New York City. He's the owner of the bar, and he sees war as maybe how we saw it during World War II. It's a black and white. It is, evil versus good. It is what we expect from war, and it's kind of what we want war to be. We want it to be clean, but it's never really that clean. So you see that kind of learning at the end of the film where they come back together, and it's really interesting how they decide to tackle this kind of nuanced political, social construct of what war is and what we expect it to be. And it's weird because it's in this like slightly comedic movie with like a marketing that makes you think it's going to be like a laugh out loud comedy, and it's not that. And I think that's what people are going to really struggle with this movie. So if I were to rate The Greatest Beer Run Ever, I would give it a 6 out of 10. I think it has some decent acting. I think it has some really interesting messaging, and I think it really tries to tackle something that's maybe a little bigger than it's able to pull off. It's a little heavy-handed in its messaging, and it's working off kind of things we've seen before in the past when it comes to these events. But the fact that it is, like, for the most part, a true life story, I don't know the details of exactly how true this is because I don't know the real story behind it. I'm going to go ahead and assume that some of it is true, if not most of it. So that is really compelling on its face. And having that lens of someone who isn't in the military, that doesn't necessarily have a vested party in the conflict, being thrown into it and being exposed to it, not knowing what war is really like, gives an interesting lens to it. And I think that's something that makes the movie just a little bit better than if it would have just went fully as a comedy. I like that it went to be serious. I wish it kind of maybe would have been more serious and decided how it wanted to be instead of trying to kind of blend these genres together. So if you checked out The Greatest Beer Run Ever, let me know what you thought about it. I'm really interested to see if people are disappointed with what they expect this movie to be versus what they get. And I think it may not satisfy either fans of war movies or dramas or historical dramas about war, or someone who's expecting like a more lighthearted comedy, like a ridiculous comedy. I think it falls in the middle. I feel like it may miss some audiences with that, but I personally enjoyed it, and it could have been a lot worse, but it could have also been a lot better. So as always, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and see you guys next time.